If you watched any baseball last year, you might be able to count on one hand how many bunts you saw. If you've been following baseball for a long time, this might sound surprising to you. The bunt was once an integral part of the game, but those days are long gone. It's gone nearly extinct in the modern game, much to the dismay of small ball enthusiasts around the world. There's a simple and well-known explanation to this decline in bunt usage, that explanation being the numbers. You can feel strongly one way or the other about the bunt, but the numbers don't lie. Or do they? Well, the numbers themselves don't lie, but the interpretation and narrative around these numbers sure could be a little misleading. Bunting can be used as a strategy to affect the team in the form of a sacrifice. It can also be used as a weapon to get on base. Is the sacrifice bunt truly dead? Is bunting for a hit not actually worth it? Is bunting useless? A lot of people will respond yes to these questions, with the general idea that bunting is bad. That would actually be wrong though. In fact, bunting is probably a lot more useful than you think, and the numbers actually prove it. By the way, only 16% of you watching this are subscribed, so if you enjoy the video, consider subscribing. It's completely free, and you can always unsubscribe at any time. Nobody knows truly when the bunt was first invented, but it's safe to say that it's been around for a long time. The earliest known account of the bunt took place in 1864. Over time, though, the play has changed a lot. During the dead ball era from 1900 to 1918, the bunt would thrive as it was thought to be a valuable asset to a team's offense. Since home runs weren't being hit, sacrificing an out in order to move a runner up wasn't a huge trade-off. Here's a graph of the number of sacrifice bunts that were attempted from the late 19th century to 1918. Sacrifice bunts were successful at a rate of over 1 per game. That means in most games, you would see one of these plays happen. After the dead ball era ended though, people began to realize that maybe these home runs and extra base hits are something that we should be focusing on. The sacrifice slowly declined into the early 21st century, and of course in the past 15 years or so, the numbers have completely taken over the game, which caused this slow decline of the bunt to quicken its descent. Then the universal DH was put into play in 2022, and there were suddenly no more pitchers batting. This caused the bunt to fall to near zero for the first time in history. In 2024, the average game had 0.09 successful sacrifice bunts in it. In other words, every 12 games had a sac bunt in it. But just how bad are these numbers behind this play? The simplest way to argue against the value of a sacrifice is to look at the run expectancy matrix. There are 8 different ways that runners can be arranged on the bases and 3 different out scenarios for each. This table has the 8 base arrangements and the 3 out scenarios shown, with each intersection between the two being the number of runs that are expected to score in that state. Let's take a look at the first scenario a sacrifice would be called. Runner on first, nobody out. In that state, the offense is expected to score 0.831 runs. If you were to sacrifice an out to move that runner to second, the offense would only be expected to score 0.644 runs. In this scenario, the sac bunt decreases the run expectancy for the offense. The same is true with a runner on first and 1 out. The sacrifice in that scenario has a similar effect. Well, what about with a runner on second? The run expectancy goes from 1.068 to 0.865 after a successful sacrifice. The pattern is the same with 1 out. The last scenario is runners on first and second. The run expectancy goes down from 1.373 to 1.352 after a successful sacrifice. Very close, but it's a negative change. Also, you have to take into account that all of these are assuming that the bunt is successful. In the best case scenario, the offense is expected to score less runs. This isn't even taking into account the possibilities of a pop-up or poorly placed bunt and nobody advances, or in the worst case, a double play on a failed bunt attempt. So obviously, bunting doesn't quite have the allure that it once did. If you ask somebody that knows all of these numbers that I just talked about, they would probably go on a long tirade on just how bad bunting is. The play has been so numerically attacked that it's barely even taught anymore at the professional level. You aren't seeing minor league players work on the bunting technique on a daily basis, especially the top prospects. Bunting is probably one of the last things that the organization is developing on those guys. So when they get to the major league level, bunting isn't really even an option. So all of this would make you think that bunting is completely useless, right? Wrong. This is a lie. And some recent rule changes make bunting even more important. When is a run the most important? One of the most important runs are the winning runs that are on base in a tie game. These scenarios are different. You don't need to maximize your run expectancy, you need to maximize your probability for just 1 run. In scenarios when the game is tied in the 9th inning or later and there's a runner on second with no outs as the home team, bunting just might be the right move. Take the situation with no outs and a runner on second. The odds of that runner scoring and the home team winning the game is on average 60.8%. With a runner on third and one out, the odds of that runner scoring go up to 64.8% after a successful sacrifice bunt. Just because this number is higher doesn't mean it's automatically a great move though, because when you call the sac bunt, a successful sac bunt is not the only outcome you can get, as I talked about before. Here's a table that Fangraphs produced that shows these outcomes, their likelihood of happening, and the odds that the runner scores. If we multiply across and add up the values, we get the expected value of around 63.5%. That probability is higher than the 60.8% that we started with. It is a smaller difference, and the decision as a manager might change depending on who's up at the plate. If someone like Aaron Judge, Vlad Guerrero Jr., or Shohei Ohtani is up, they're not going to be bunting. We're just speaking in averages, and on average, bunting is a very good idea in this spot. This only applies when you're the home team and the game is tied. If you're down a run, you should swing away, as on average, the bunt will net a win 22.9% of the time and a tie 40.5% of the time at the end of the inning. Whereas swinging away nets a win 29.1% of the time and a tie 32.7% of the time at the end of the inning. Well, what if you're the away team in this situation? Here are the possible outcomes given a successful visitor bunt, along with the probability that the home team wins. If we calculate all this out and get the total probability, on average, the home team will win 52.9% of the time, even given the fact that the bunt was successful by the away team. As the away team, it's not smart to play for just one run. The home team has a substantial advantage when put in this extra inning situation. They have access to a lot more information than the away team does. The away team obviously doesn't know how many runs the home team will score in the bottom of the inning, so they aren't able to make their decisions based on that knowledge. The home team, on the other hand, obviously knows what happened in the top of the inning, so they can maximize their chances of winning with that in mind. So, going back to this first scenario, there is a time in the game where bunting, on average, increases the probability of a win. And these are high leverage scenarios that have a huge impact on the game's outcome. With the recent rule changes, all extra innings start with a runner on second, often referred to as the Manfred runner. So, this situation happens more than it used to. In fact, it happens a lot more than it used to. From 2015 to 2019 without the rule, 2017 had the most bottom of the inning, winning run on second, nobody out scenarios with 43 games. 2020, of course, the ghost runner rule would be put into effect, but it was only a 60-game season. In 2021, there was a huge jump to 103 different games that included this scenario. The numbers that we've already talked about were just theoretical run expectancy calculations, but now that we've had 5 seasons with these new rules, what do the results actually say? Has bunting been successful in these situations? Since 2020, there have been 421 different games that had the winning run on second base and nobody out. The home team got to this scenario and chose to not bunt 266 times out of the 421. They won the game around 80% of the time. This is larger than the probabilities that we just talked about because this is not just the probability that the run scores. This is the percent of the time that they won the game. They can still go to the next inning and win the game, and that will count as a success too. The home team chose to bunt 155 times. This sample includes all games where in this scenario, a batter either fouled off a bunt, missed a bunt, or put a bunt in play. If a batter only pulled back a bunt, then it's not included in here, as those are not differentiated in the play-by-play data. In these games, they won around 82% of the time. A small increase, but an increase nonetheless. So it is a lie. There is a use for the sacrifice bunt after all, and the numbers even prove it. Teams still don't really agree with these numbers though, as in 2024, they only bunted 36 out of the 99 occurrences of this scenario. Now obviously, these decisions probably won't make or break a team's season, but winning a World Series is hard, and as a Major League Baseball franchise, you want to give yourself as much of an advantage as you can. Believe it or not, this is just half of the lie though. We've only talked about bunting in the way that it pertains to a team's strategy as a whole. Now it's time to talk about some individual players who can use the bunt as a weapon. Take a look at this graph that relates a player's volume of bunt hits to their efficiency over the past 2 seasons. The farther to the right the player is, the more bunt hits they have. The farther upwards a player is, the more efficient they have been when bunting for a hit. To measure efficiency, I'm using a stat called Bunt Hit Percentage, which is just the percentage of bunt singles out of all at-bats that ended in a bunt. Now, as I was explaining all of that, your eyes probably wandered towards this data point all the way over here. It's an outlier, and naturally, it draws more attention. But before I reveal who this is, we need to talk about the other way that bunting is used to get on base. It's pretty clear that the math behind a sacrifice bunt doesn't quite work out in its favor. If a player can get on base via the bunt, however, the math will love that. Bunting for a hit should still be relevant in today's game, right? Well, it's not really. As you can see here, the percentage of hits that came from bunts are well below what we saw from earlier in the 21st century. Some of this is due to the decline in the sacrifice, as some sacrifice bunts will naturally turn into hits, but it still definitely shows a decline in bunting for a hit. On average, when a position player bunts, it turns into a hit around 30% of the time. This bunt hit percentage has gradually increased over the years. This is probably due to the fact that defenses are expecting a bunt much less often than 20 years ago, even in a non-sacrifice situation. Position players in general are just bunting a lot less. That includes sacrifice bunts and bunting for a hit. So defenses are probably just not expecting it as much as they used to. This could open the door for more bunt hits. There's been one player in the league recently that's mastered this art of bunting for a hit. Let's revisit that graph. There are a handful of players that have successfully reached base on a bunt hit on more than a dozen occasions in the past 2 seasons. Guys like Bryce Terang, Jake McCarthy, Jacob Young, Dalton Varsho, Garrett Stubbs, Luke Raley, Jose Altuve. These are all players that control the bat really well, and most of them are pretty fast. But none of them compare to the Bunt King from the past 2 seasons over here. He has successfully laid down 21 bunt hits and has a bunt hit percentage near 500. This player is TJ Friedl. What makes this even more impressive is that 17 of these bunt hits came from 2023, as in 2024 he broke his wrist in spring training and missed half of the season. I analyzed every single one of these 21 bunt singles, and he's not just going up there throwing the bat out, there is a pretty clear strategy. First off, he will do it at any time. Leading off an inning, runner on third, even with 2 strikes, he laid a couple bunts down. Secondly, how he bunts is highly dependent on the pitcher. 13 of the 21 bunts came when the pitcher was a lefty, and of those 13 bunts, 12 of them were pulled to the first base side of the infield. This makes sense as a lefty pitcher will finish his motion with momentum to the third base side. Sometimes this will completely take the pitcher out of the play. The defense has to rely on either their second baseman charging in and fielding it, or their first baseman to come and get it and hope the second baseman can get to the bag in time. Pulling the bunt also allows Friedl to almost get a running start, as he's already moving towards first base before the ball's even hit sometimes. Against right-handed pitchers, 6 out of the 8 bunts were pushed to the third base side of the infield. The same reasoning applies here. The third baseman or catcher will most likely have to make a good play in order to get Friedl out. But what does this all mean? Let's take a look at his 2023 season numbers. He batted .279 with an on-base percentage of .352, a slug of .467, and an OPS of .816. But what if we assume that he never attempted to lay down a single bunt? If we exclude all plate appearances that ended in a bunt, his batting average drops to .261, his on-base drops to .338, and his OPS drops down to .801. This isn't some crazy huge difference, but bunting clearly makes Friedl a better and more valuable player. In 2024, Friedl had more of a down year swinging the bat, but the numbers without bunting are still marginally worse, even with him only getting 4 bunt hits in that season. The value of the bunt doesn't end there, however. It allows him to get on base at a higher clip, as we just saw. Friedl just so happens to be one of the best base runners in the league. In his last full season, he had 6.1 base running runs, which was 8th in the league and was in the 96th percentile in base running value according to Baseball Savant. A lot of people don't realize just how much value base running can provide. This allows him to generate even more value for the Reds as a base runner. Friedl was a near 4 WAR player in 2023, which a lot of people question how that was possible. A lot of it comes from his base running. And if you think about it, a big reason why Friedl was able to accrue 4 WAR was because of the bunt. And there are many players out there that could possibly benefit from this weapon too. Ironically, when I started researching for this video, I tended to make a video about how bunting is bad and the math behind it just doesn't work. The numbers do show that the traditional sacrifice bunt often decreases run expectancy, but the more I researched, the more I realized that the bunt is a powerful tool that's been overly attacked by the numbers. There are key situations, especially now with the Manfred runner, where bunting actually increases a team's chance of winning. And for certain players, bunting isn't just a strategic move, it's a weapon that can turn outs into hits. Despite this, bunting is still fading from the game. Teams and players are correctly prioritizing power and slugging over small ball, and it's unlikely that we'll ever see bunting return to its former prominence. But in the right hands and in the right moments, the bunt can still be a game-changing play. The way I see it, Major League Baseball needs to be bunting more, or, well, at least when it makes sense to bunt. So, next time someone tries to tell you that bunting is useless, tell them that that is a lie. Thank you for watching, subscribe if you enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.